There's something vulnerable about highway rest stops in the deep hours of night. The lights hum. The lot fills with quiet machines, rigs and station wagons that have become mobile bedrooms for truckers and families. Even the air seems to thicken, making every shape and shadow sharper, closer, crawling with the possibility of story. When you're out there, miles away from your comfort zone, it's not just the unknown you stand guard against, but the strange, unwanted instincts of the world. My story starts just like that, tense, sleepless, and somewhere in North Carolina, parked under the toothy glow of a gas station sign. I had joined my dad, Harold, for a 3-day journey from our small Georgia town as he made his East Coast delivery run. He's been a long-haul trucker for years, a mountain of a man with weathered knuckles and the sort of patience that only endless highways can teach. I just turned 17, not quite adult, but with enough years to crave my own adventures. I wanted to know what life was like behind the big wheel before chasing my CDL. The run from Georgia to North Carolina was uneventful, all open fields and interstate sameness. We arrived late in the evening, delivering early goods nearby. Between midnight and 1, Dad eased our truck into a space behind the humming rhythm of diesel engines. Most drivers were already asleep, prepping for the dawn's work. In that strange stillness after the lull, even routine choices gather an edge. Despite the fatigue, I was wide awake by 2 a.m. I remember lying on the bunk, counting the gentle snoring coming from the driver's seat until restlessness won. I grabbed my razor, figuring I could straighten up my mustache in the empty rest stop bathrooms, simple, familiar routine. Just a late-night trim, or so I thought. I didn't even bring my phone at first. Who would I call in the dead of night, anyway? I walked into the building, harsh fluorescent lights, a faint trace of industrial cleaner in the air. The restroom split left and right. I turned left, nearly missing the form silently standing there, a man, tall, far taller than me, at least 6 feet 4 inches with shoulders like the stall doors. He just stood by the urinal, staring at the tiled wall. His presence was hard to ignore, but nothing about him said immediate threat. Clean jeans, heavy jacket, a close-cut beard. I ducked into a stall, did my business, washed up, and fully expected to leave without a story. But some part of my mind clipped a warning as I realized he hadn't moved. Not in almost 5 minutes. I dried my hands with automatic paper towels, giving a quick side glance, still rooted by the urinal, unmoving. I thought nothing of it, tried to suppress some silly city-born anxiety. But then, as I headed for the exit, I heard the telltale sound of his zipper. That, too, felt rehearsed. Like it had been timed just as I moved. Wanting a little more space, I doubled back to the right-hand side, hoping he'd just do what he came for and leave. For a guy eager for privacy, I suddenly found myself checking every reflective surface around me, every shadow by the entrance. My hands shook more than usual while I tried to shape my mustache in the mirror. Only 10 seconds had passed when the same man entered silently behind me. This wasn't a coincidence. He moved with intentional quiet, barely making a sound across the tile. There's a moment, just before fear locks in, when your brain tries to explain everything away. Maybe he just preferred this side, maybe the hand dryer was broken next door. But as I palmed my little travel blade, I glanced into the mirror and saw him right behind me. He jerked to a halt, not 2 feet away. For a split second, surprise colored his face, as if something about the sight of me holding a blade startled him out of a script. The tension was electric, humming between us. I tried to act like nothing was wrong, finishing up my routine as naturally as possible, keeping the blade visible but non-threatening. The man sidled over to the urinal again, pretending to unzip, all while sneaking glances in my direction. He waved. I offered a tight, neutral nod in return, move I'd learned was safer than outright turning your back or looking scared. Seconds crawled. The man ducked into a stall, eyes tracking me. I caught a reflection, he was standing ramrod still, staring with huge, unblinking eyes. I willed myself not to show nerves, not to hurry or stumble. Quietly, I finished my last stroke, heart pounding, every instinct yelling at me to run. Moving calmly was the hardest act of the night. If I rushed, he would know I was scared. But if I lingered, I'd give him more time. I finished my mustache, wiped the blade, my knuckles shining white around the handle, and made my way toward the exit, passing so close I caught a whiff of some strange, clean aftershave. My skin prickled as I noticed his eyes bouncing between my hands and my face, cataloging every move. I forced myself not to flinch or break stride, even as every bone in my body screamed for me to sprint. The sense of threat was so real it radiated against my ribs, drumming with my rapid pulse. As I stepped outside, I listened for footsteps, nothing. But turning slightly, I spotted the reflection of security cameras installed above the bathroom entrance, their red blink like a silent guardian. Relief filled me in a sudden silent wave. If anything happened, at least the incident would be on footage, witnessed by more than my nerves. Back in the truck, Dad still snored away, arms slung over his forehead, blissfully unaware. I climbed in quietly. The cabin felt like a fortress compared to the raw exposure of the bathroom. I sat, knees drawn up, watching the lot through a narrow gap in the curtain, wondering if the stranger had lingered inside, if he'd noticed my guarded exit. Nothing moved under the soft shine of the station lamps except for moths and the lazy blink of a truck's hazard lights. I grabbed my phone and messaged my friend, Taylor, someone I knew would answer, even in the pre-dawn emptiness. I spilled the story, thumbs flying, adrenaline finally distilling into anxiety. It took nearly 20 minutes for him to respond, but when he did, his advice made me hesitate. Go back to the bathroom. FaceTime me. Let's see if he's still there. I never would have gone alone, but the suggestion sparked indignation in me. Was I overreacting? Was my mind conjuring phantoms from harmless weirdness? I pressed the video call button, letting Taylor's familiar face fill the small screen, the way you might clutch a lucky charm in the palm of your hand. Headlights yawning in the background, I slipped out, letting Taylor's voice in my ear become a shield. The station was silent except for a soft country song leaking from somewhere. I walked through the brief echoing hallway into the restroom. Empty. No echo of boots, not even the fading smell of that antiseptic aftershave. I made a quick circuit, pointing the camera's lens at every mirror and corner, narrating in a half-whisper. Taylor, ever the detective, asked for details. Show me exactly where he was, how he looked at you, was there any mark, any tattoo? You're making me feel more crazy, dude, I said, which was true and also not, because the weirdness of the encounter still sat between my shoulder blades, as heavy as a bruise. 5 minutes later, I exited, feeling the wash of air across my arms with new alertness. It was past 3 a.m. by now, the world dipped even deeper into dark. As I headed back to the truck, something caught my eye. In a dimly separated parking lot behind the rest area, a single red car had its headlights on, strange, considering it was the only vehicle illuminated in the far lot. Just as I looked up, the headlights clicked off. Instinct told me to keep moving. I had no proof that it was the same man, but a chill crept up my neck. I hurried back to the truck, climbed in, and this time I locked both doors with trembling hands. Dad shifted, mumbled in his sleep, and didn't stir. The rest of the night passed without another incident. Rain started tapping on the metal roof before sunrise, making the world outside feel more distant, less threatening. In truth, I didn't sleep. I watched the darkness dissolve out of the corners. At first light, other drivers shuffled out, jogging across the lot, stretching tired limbs. The world was suddenly mundane again. I never told Dad about that night, not then, not after. He's the kind of parent who keeps rules sharp and close, who worries loudly, and who'd never have let me set foot alone at a rest stop again if he'd known. Besides, I wanted my independence more than just about anything. My only confidant was Taylor, who checked in the next day to see how I was holding up, who made dark jokes to try and shove the dread aside. But the memory stuck. That man, his pristine clothes, his cold stare, the way he mirrored my movements wasn't any ordinary traveler, and certainly not a lost soul looking for help. There was a plan there, the kind of plot you won't ever quite unravel. I've replayed the night 100 different ways. What would have happened if I hadn't kept that little blade with me? If I'd ignored my instincts, or if fear had made me run? Sometimes just carrying a piece of sharp steel, and just enough nerve, is all that stands between you and a much darker ending. Long after the night in North Carolina, the lesson lingered. It became a shadow I couldn't ignore, shaping how I noticed the world and all its ordinary dangers. Most nights, back home, I'd walk streets far more crowded and neon-lit than any silent rest stop, and yet, the feeling was often oddly similar. No matter the size of the city, something dangerous can hide in the folds of routine. I've lived in New York City nearly all my life. It's a place where crowds are armor and isolation at 2 a.m. on a subway platform can feel sharper than loneliness. People swarm like schools of fish, but everyone floats in their own separate universe, eyes forward, head down, invisible lines you don't cross. By my 20s, I was a seasoned city commuter. Walking from the MTA to my apartment over dark blocks was just background noise. 2 hours, 2 trains, 30 minutes by bus, and a final walk through streets that held their quiet secrets. But twice, the city reminded me that volume of people, of noise, of even self-confidence, does not equal safety. The first time happened on a train, late enough that only a dozen souls shared the car with me. I'd stepped in as the doors sighed shut, headphones pressing another world into my ears. At first, I didn't clock the figure pacing near the pole, a man in a ragged jacket, face drawn tight, eyes locked onto me. Even with music playing, I could sense the push of his attention, the heavy beat of his stare following my every move. I removed an earbud politely, as I've done 1,000 times, bracing for a harmless question or, at worst, a beg for change. Instead, he spat venom. "Hey, you bitch. You think you're better than me?" The insult ripped through the air, shattering any hope of a regular commute. My face burned as I felt every other rider do their best to dissolve into the upholstery. In those seconds, nothing feels more isolating than being publicly singled out with anger. I scanned the car for help, but nobody wanted to meet my gaze. People have a practiced art of ignoring trouble. At the next stop, nowhere close to home, I slipped off, heart slamming into my chest, and dove into another car before the doors sealed behind me. I spent the next 2 stops watching for the man's exit, praying he'd disappear before I reached my transfer. My hands shook as I gripped my phone, thumb hovering over the emergency button, but he finally vanished into the crowd. I melted into my seat, lungs burning with relief. That encounter could have passed as just another city scare, a notch in the long ledger of urban weirdness, if not for the next one, a night that carved dread into my bones. I was in graduate school by then. Classes often ended after 10 p.m. By the time I caught the last bus to my neighborhood, the city's pulse slowed. Night buses are strange, the hum of the engine is louder, the lights harsher or dimmer, and each rider keeps a practiced distance. Nobody wants to notice anyone else, which only makes the isolation more pronounced. I remember listening to a podcast about real-life horror stories, letting my mind wander as the city blushed past in blue and gold. I got off a block from home, thinking about whether to pick up dinner at Popeyes, craving greasy comfort food. Halfway down the street, I doubled back, stomach winning over bedtime. That's when I first saw him, a man from my bus, standing too still under the flicker of a broken streetlight, watching me with wide, voracious eyes. He stopped when I did, like a badly synchronized shadow, and continued to stare as I entered the store. I pretended not to see. The place was nearly empty. I lingered for only a moment, grabbed a snack, then headed back out. Halfway home, I realized he had moved, now standing right at the edge of my block, precisely where the lights failed and the neighborhood slipped into darkness. As I neared, he didn't flinch. I slowed, dialing my brother without even thinking, the quiver in my voice enough to tell him something was horribly wrong. My brother, normally unreachable at that hour, promised to meet me, telling me to stay close to the lit areas near the shops. I did just that, circling the liquor store, eyes scanning the faces gathered outside, hungry for any sign of someone familiar. Instead, the man approached, hands hidden, voice oiled with false generosity. You lost? Need help? His repetition, his insistence, too eager, too forward. No, I'm fine, I said, stepping back as he edged closer, latex gloves glinting under the street lamp, gloves out of season, out of context, the strangest detail of all. If he was being cautious, why no mask? Why no coat for the cold? As he pressed for me to go home, all nerves inside me screamed that nothing about him was right. That single, offbeat detail, the gloves, still echoes for me. Years later, the memory of that night runs in slow motion every time I cross a dim street corner, a silent warning reverberating in my bones. I remained rooted near the liquor store's neon glow, my phone pressed tight to my cheek, my brother's voice in my ears promising he'd be there soon. The stranger, undeterred, kept advancing, each step calculated, an actor in a scene only he understood. He asked again, "You sure you're okay? I really can help you." But his tone, practiced too many times, never matched his words. I answered, firmer this time, "No. I said I'm fine." Still, he didn't back away. Instead, he wove closer, circling my bubble of space, latex fingers flexing as if preparing for some secret chore. My mind ran frantic calculations, how far to the shop's entrance? How close was my brother now? The urge to run itched in my calves, but I stayed. Big city survival had taught me that drawing attention, planting yourself in the most public strip of light, sometimes does more to keep the worst at bay than any weapon could. My eyes kept scanning for a familiar face, hunting for intervention I felt ashamed to need. Then, almost on cue, the man disappeared inside the liquor store, the bell above the door jingling like a strange reprieve. Adrenaline crashed through me just as a form rounded the corner, my brother, Calvin, striding the block like a walking exclamation mark. No questions, just outstretched arms and a look that promised safety. My nerves fizzed, but finally, I let myself breathe. Together, we doubled back home, scanning over our shoulders every few steps. I told Calvin everything, the man from the bus, the hungry way he watched, the gloves, his repeated demands. Calvin listened, jaw set. "Next time, call me first thing," he said, and insisted we leave the house together for a while, to throw off any trail. His confidence made my dread dissipate almost. That night changed something fundamental in me. I found myself replaying it days, weeks, months later, long after the streetlights faded and my own fear could barely keep up with normal life. I started noticing patterns I'd missed before, who lingered on which corner, which cars idled too long, who walked with too much interest along my route. Awareness sharpened into something less like anxiety and more like a sixth sense, a radar for variant rhythms in a crowd. The truth is, when you're alone in the city at night, every moment stretches and contracts. 5 minutes can feel like an hour. Memory lies, compressing the terror into a snapshot while your body remembers the precise knotted feeling forever. I stopped wearing both earbuds at once, learned to trust my discomfort, and never, ever traveled a dark side street again without backup. Time passed. The memory faded but never left. That's the thing with close calls, they shadow ordinary life, coloring every otherwise mundane choice, where to sit, when to linger, whether to trust the wave of a friendly stranger. Even so, I tried not to let fear claim my entire sense of freedom. I told myself that vigilance wasn't paranoia, just preparedness. If someone else had been in my shoes, I'd have urged them to do exactly as I did, stay in the light, keep moving, call someone, trust your gut. It's not weakness to acknowledge danger, it's the way we survive. Years down the line, when my friends would talk big about late-night eats in strange neighborhoods, I quietly kept my stories close. Not out of shame, but out of a stubborn desire not to scare them or tarnish their sense of invincibility. I told Calvin everything, but only years later did I tell my parents the whole story. They listened, pale-faced, hands wringing napkins, and swore to always pick up the phone, no matter the hour. That's another little truth I've learned, most stories of near misses never get told in full. We edit them, smooth their edges, wrap our panic in punchlines, and carry the weight alone. But fear doesn't diminish in silence, it just sharpens, until the lesson finally finds a voice. Sometimes I look back and wonder about that man with the gloves. Was there ever another target? Had he followed someone else into the darkness that night, or did my caution change everything for both of us? The real stories aren't always grislier endings, they're the ones where we refuse to become a victim, where instinct, awareness, and a little luck stand between us and a memory that could have been so much worse. If I could whisper a warning to anyone traveling alone at night, especially to anyone who thinks, it could never happen to me, it would be this: listen to your own unease. You don't have to justify your caution. If something feels wrong, it probably is. Outrunning close calls eventually becomes a strange badge, an invisible thread you share with every cautious traveler who's ever felt their heart in their throat at midnight. I'd always assumed things like this were rare, that if you kept your head down, the world would leave you alone. But the more stories you listen to, the more you realize how often near misses are the rule, not the exception. A few years after that tense night with the man in gloves, I heard a story from a friend that sent a chill rippling back through every memory of my own misadventures. His name was Marcelo, a quiet, studious kid I knew from university in Spain. Despite being the picture of reserve, always neat, always punctual, Marcelo had an experience that unspooled like something out of a psychological thriller. He grew up in a large southern city, the kind of place dotted with small houses and neat apartment blocks, no looming sense of peril from abandoned buildings or back alleys. For Marcelo, danger felt like a distant concept, something that only circled the news and never touched his life. His parents were loving but cautious, the sort who double-check every lock and set curfews a full hour before sunset when he was younger. Honestly, he'd always craved more space, more nights to himself. It's a familiar young adult greed, the spark of independence, hungry for a little trouble, a little taste of unsupervised life. One weekend, Marcelo's parents left town to visit relatives. He'd been looking forward to the stretch of unsupervised freedom for weeks, planning a quiet evening with old friends, pizza, and video games. That Friday, however, duty called. His university's annual geography competition was mandatory. Being naturally competitive, he went, forming a 6-person team, and spent the night in the crowded student lounge, swept up in trivia and laughter until the very last round. Hours later, victorious but tired, Marcelo separated from his group, catching the last subway home. It was one of those brisk October nights, the air just cold enough to hint at winter's approach, the city slowing down under a velvet sky. He got out alone at his usual stop, barely noticing the silence pressing on his ears after the noise of the university. The walk home was short, less than 10 minutes. Then, suddenly, his world snapped wide and raw. As he approached the final corner near his house, a scream split the darkness, a sound so sharp, so full of agony that it froze Marcelo in place. It wasn't just a yell, it was a crescendo of pain, a human cry that clawed under his skin and set his nerves on fire. Houses all down the street were dark and quiet. Birds stopped singing. Even the streetlights seemed to flicker, terrified. A second scream soon followed, echoing through the night, this one closer, more desperate. Marcelo's instincts screamed at him to run, but he couldn't yet see through the blur of panic where the sound was coming from. Only when he turned and glimpsed a knot of people, 4, maybe 5, sprinting toward him across the deserted street did everything snap into focus. They were strangers, haggard and wild, their movements strangely urgent. Without hesitation, Marcelo bolted. His house, to his horror, stood directly between him and this rushing group. He dashed madly for his front door, breathing so hard his throat burned, every whisper of wind at his back feeling like a hand reaching to grab him. Fumbling with keys, he jammed the lock, slammed the heavy door behind him, and sank down in darkness, pulse jackhammering in his ears. He waited. He listened. The screams had stopped, replaced with a silence so thick it felt almost as tangible as a threat. Every muscle locked up, ready to spring. Marcelo pressed his ear to the wood, every instinct straining for a hint of pursuit or movement. Nothing came, no shouts, no footsteps, just the slow creak of fear leaking into his bones. Eventually, curiosity overcame terror. He crept to a window, heart high in his chest, and peered out at the empty street, the world perfectly still and blandly ordinary, the kind of silence that mocks you for being scared. But Marcelo trusted his memory. He knew what he'd heard: pain, pursuit, the wordless warning of a city flipping suddenly, awfully dangerous. That night, he barely slept, every small sound a possible threat. When morning came, it felt unreal. He tried to box up his nerves, called a friend, and managed to stammer out a version of events that trimmed most of the terror away. It didn't help. Even the telling left him shaky, replaying possibilities over breakfast, unsure whether he was the lucky one for having escaped, or the fool for not calling for help. Marcelo spent the rest of Saturday pretending at normalcy, though every little noise around the house seemed to thrum with hidden threat. He willed himself to keep busy, tidying, pacing, cooking a frozen pizza that somehow tasted like cardboard and nerves. When his only friend who'd planned to visit that weekend called to cancel on account of a stomach bug, Marcelo almost felt relief. He wasn't ready to recount the pure, sour rush of panic from the night before. Alone, he wandered between windows, checking the locks, scanning the stillness outside. His parents called around noon, asking the usual questions about food, sleep, and the state of his studies. "Everything's fine," he lied, voice a little too bright. It wasn't that he wanted to mislead them, but his mother spooked easily. She'd been known to book a train home over a stubbed toe or a missed text. Marcelo made up something about losing at the geography event, though the truth was he and his team came in second, a tiny victory rendered meaningless by real-life terror. It wasn't until the afternoon faded into blue evening that his senses began to settle. The street beyond his window was as quiet as ever, giving nothing away. That night, he tried to shake off the tension with an old favorite movie, curling up in a blanket, popcorn at hand. He was halfway through the second act when a sharp knock jolted him upright. For a moment, he was certain someone had thrown a rock against his window. He pressed pause, straining to listen. Was it just his imagination or another sign that the previous night was not yet behind him? Silence. No footsteps, no second knock. He peered through the blinds, heart hammering all over again. The street outside glowed under weak lamplight, utterly ordinary. A dog barked somewhere, then quiet returned, denser than before. His imagination conjured 1,000 horrors: the group from the street, lurking out of sight, the source of that tortured scream, trapped somewhere nearby, some new stranger, testing the limits of how much fear a young man could carry in his chest before shattering. Should he call the police? He hesitated, unsure how to explain what he'd seen, or rather, what he'd felt. Marcelo had always believed fear needed a reason, some physical threat you could see and name. Now, he wasn't so sure. Every instinct urged caution. At the very least, he wanted someone, somewhere, to be aware of what he'd experienced, if only to tether his anxiety to something real. Breathing slow, Marcelo finally called emergency services. He spilled out every detail: the screams, the running strangers, his own wild dash into the house, the silence afterward. The woman on the line seemed indifferent, asking more questions about whether he knew anyone involved than about Marcelo's unease. Maybe, she suggested, it was a prank. Or maybe, she reasoned, he'd misheard some local drama. Since he wasn't hurt, they could only promise to send a patrol through the neighborhood. It was small comfort, a distant reassurance against the heat curling under his skin. When the police cruiser finally drifted by, its blue lights swirling onto the pavement and then vanishing into the far streets, Marcelo felt a little safer, if only for a moment. He didn't sleep well that night. In the depths of half-dreams, screams still tore the quiet, shadows waited outside every window, and his own heartbeat made him flinch anew each hour. He never was sure if the noise he'd heard was real, a threat, a warning, or just a slice of fear that snuck in alongside the autumn air. The next morning, his parents returned, opening the door, arms full of suitcases, laughter filling the hallway. They found Marcelo pale, tired, hair rumpled with residual fright. After hauling bags and exchanging light jokes, Marcelo finally decided to tell them something had happened, though he sanded down the rawness, left out the wild sprint, the thick desperation of his fear, the sense that he'd been prey. His parents listened, silent and tight-lipped, and then his father announced he'd call a local security company. Within a week, security cameras bloomed over their front and back doors. Locks were checked, the fence repaired, and Marcelo's mother began texting him every evening at dusk. Even so, normalcy crept back into the house, routine, though cracked, regained some authority. Marcelo never did learn what became of the people who ran at him that night. For months, he would check local news for mentions of an assault, accident, or missing persons report. There were none. Questions haunted him, but answers never came. He learned, as all of us do eventually, that sometimes you don't get resolution, just the wisdom, sharpened like a blade, to never walk home alone at night without your key ready and an eye on every shadow. It's the unpredictability that lingers, the way terror can slip into perfectly normal hours, reshaping places you thought were safe into landscapes of suspicion. For Marcelo, even after the cameras blinked reassuring red at every entrance, he found himself double-checking latches and sometimes waking in the dead of night to replay the sprint from street to door. Sleep, which used to come easy, was now repeatedly broken by dreams in which footsteps pursued him through shifting city alleys that always bent just out of sight. In the weeks that followed, he became hyper-aware of routine. Any strange car parked too long on his street prompted him to jot down plates, just in case. If someone walked the same stretch of sidewalk at the same time as him twice in a week, Marcelo felt his skin prickle. Late one evening a glass shattered in the distance, a sound he'd normally write off to some drunk neighbor or stray cat, and Marcelo was instantly at the window, peering out as quietly as he could. But nothing happened, the illusion of normalcy held. He never spoke with his friends about the full terror of that night. What can you say, except that your trust in the simple act of coming home on foot is forever altered? But Marcelo listened more closely now, both to his instincts and to those of others. When classmates whispered about bad encounters on the metro, or friends joked about how a shortcut saved a few minutes, Marcelo always found himself warning, stay in the light, don't get distracted, call someone if you get a bad feeling. The advice sounded so much like his parents' old warnings that he sometimes had to laugh at himself, the young man who used to roll his eyes at all their caution. But these things don't leave you. Every story of a narrow escape you hear becomes a new brick in the fortress of caution you build around yourself and those you care about. One autumn night, Marcelo's neighbor, Elena, an older woman who'd lived across the street for 3 decades, knocked on the door. Her dog had refused to walk past the corner, growling at nothing. She wanted to know if Marcelo had noticed anything odd lately. He felt the chill of the old fear crawl up his spine as he nodded. Apparently, a few days earlier, someone had rattled her back gate, and she was still jumpy from the experience. Marcelo reassured her quietly, walked her back across the yard, and checked the locks himself. He realized then, even a brief, unexplained incident can become a whisper in the neighborhood's memory, and everyone, sooner or later, learns to listen more closely. By now, sleep came a little easier, helped both by time and the silent watch of their new cameras. But Marcelo never reclaimed the same sense of invincibility. Gradually, he forged new rituals. He'd text his arrival home the moment he walked in the door. On most nights he'd run through his checklist, windows latched, screens shut, keys by the bed, before letting the day slip away. Some might say it was excessive. To Marcelo, it was simply the cost of feeling secure in a world that sometimes shows its teeth. The possibility that nothing was ever as it seemed, that the men running that night were something other than dangerous, that the scream was never a lure, remained, but Marcelo chose caution over comfort. For a young man who once prided himself on logic, it was a subtle shift. Security, he realized, isn't found in what you know, but in what you prepare for. Months faded into a new normal. The weather warmed, family routines returned. The story became a lesson quietly embedded in the fabric of his life, a shaping pressure rather than a constant ache. It became easier to share just the outline with others, how caution is wisdom, not weakness. It made him a resource, someone friends now called if they needed a late-night ride, or advice on home security. He took their trust as proof he hadn't only gained scars that night, but something harder to measure, a sense of stewardship. But even as normal life returned, Marcelo sometimes stood at the window, watching dusk creep down the street, wondering if he would ever really know the truth of that night. Had he escaped something truly sinister, or just let his imagination sprint to fill the silence? That uncertainty, he discovered, is universal, and it binds everyone who's come close to the edge. Some nights, he'd catch reflection in glass, his own grown-up face, sharpened just slightly by fear and vigilance. And he'd think, this is how you learn. Not from stories that end in disaster, but from those that almost do, and from the knowledge, bitter but priceless, that sometimes caution is your only defense. Stories like Marcelo's, or my own, aren't the kinds of tales you boast about. There's no hero's triumph, no single moment of vanquishing a villain. Instead, what you're left with are questions and a heightened sense of just how finely balanced safety can be. And it's not just in lonely neighborhoods or the echo of subway tunnels, either. The truth, the uncomfortable edge to most real-life horror stories, is how quickly normal can become dangerous, and how easy it is to ignore that sense until you're forced not to. Over time, I noticed my own inner alarms growing more dependable, not just for myself but for others. When new friends would roll their eyes at my insistence on rideshares rather than walking the last few blocks alone, or would forget to lock their windows in the summer, I'd quietly fix things behind the scenes. It wasn't paranoia, not quite, it was a survival reflex, emerging from flashes of darkness that never really evaporate. And if my vigilance kept just one person from their own bad run-in, so much the better. As the years ticked on, the memory of that night in North Carolina with my dad grew more distant but never blurred away completely. Dad eventually learned about the incident, years after the fact, and his face shifted between pride and new worry all at once. Smart to have that blade on you, he admitted, accepting the lesson I'd learned the hard way, even if he still wished I'd woken him up instead of facing it alone. I knew, though, that a parent's greatest wish isn't for nothing bad to ever happen, but for you to know what to do if it does. Survival, after all, is shaped less by bravado and more by small acts of caution, unsexy, unglamorous, but true. You start to trust your unease, weighing every late-night detour. Is it worth the shortcut down the empty block, or should I loop around where people linger? Do I smile back at the man watching too closely, or does it only encourage him? When the hairs at my neck rise, do I brush it off, convincing myself it's nothing, or do I act to keep myself safe? These are questions few people answer perfectly, and the stakes are never clear until the wrong decision stumbles you into trouble. Many, just like Marcelo, find themselves replaying episodes years later, longing for certainty. Should I have called for help sooner? Was it foolish to hesitate? What did they want from me? Regret and relief wrestle beneath the skin. After my own near-miss in that silent rest stop, the most haunting thought was how close I'd come to crossing an unmarked line on someone else's script. Looking back, knowing how quickly things might have gone wrong, it's the caution, not the fear, that I'm most grateful for. The impact of these moments spins out in all directions, an invisible ripple. Friends keep keys between their fingers when walking at night because you whisper the technique to them over pizza. Siblings check in more often after late shifts. Parents give that extra reminder, please, trust your gut, call if something feels off, before letting you disappear into the city's nighttime labyrinth. You trade stories, not as warnings meant to scare, but as shields, as armor. Each anecdote a piece of hard-earned advice, trust your instincts. Don't silence your fear. And sometimes, you simply become someone else's lookout. You sit at the back of the late-night bus so you can see everyone, or you keep watch while your friend dashes into a gas station in the middle of nowhere. You keep your phone charged, set your routes 2 steps ahead, and if someone needs walking home, you offer, because you know, now, just how easily an empty street can swallow a voice. There is an empathy carved by darkness. When you've brushed the edge of real fear, you become quieter, more thoughtful in your concern for others. You notice those who hesitate at crosswalks, who tighten their jacket and keep an eye out behind them, whose shoulders shift when a crowd thins out. You learn to spot the anxious among the oblivious, and instead of growing cold or dismissive, you lean into caution as a form of care. In time, these close calls blur into something else: strength, yes, but not the invincible kind. Rather, it's the kind stitched together by memories, vivid, sometimes raw edges that set the rhythm for every instinctive choice you make. Those memories never quite vanish, but in living with them, you give yourself, and those who come after, a little more room to step out of danger's reach. If these stories have a real purpose, it's not about sowing panic, it's an invitation to awareness, a reminder that even the most ordinary lives brush up against uncertainty more often than we want to believe. After so many years of weaving caution into my everyday, I came to recognize that most people aren't as lucky as I was. Often, the difference isn't just preparedness or bravado, but a willingness to heed the quiet warnings written into your nerves long before real danger surfaces. Stories like mine, and Marcelo's, don't circulate because people want to relive the fear. They're retold as lanterns, ways to light the boundary lines when the world turns unpredictable. Sometimes, sharing even a small detail can change someone's trajectory. When my younger cousin, Gemma, moved to the city, she called for advice as if I was a seasoned expert. What should I watch out for, she'd ask before each new adventure. I'd downplay the lessons, not wanting her to carry my anxieties. But one day, after hearing about an odd man lingering at her subway stop late at night, I sensed the dread beneath her casual language. That was the moment when every bit of hard-earned vigilance felt worth it. I told her plainly, don't try to be polite if you feel unsafe. Find a crowd. Call someone even if it feels embarrassing. You'll never regret being careful. The world doesn't hand out warnings, most of the time, it lets us stumble blind into the turns that matter most. We try on versions of ourselves, brave, street-smart, indifferent, whatever it takes to move through the night unscathed. But the real skill is in discerning when your body knows more than your brain. Some call it paranoia, but I call it experience, that pulse, that tightening in your chest that nudges you to move a little quicker, to change direction, to not linger when your instincts start thrumming. Of course, people learn caution at different paces. Some carry decades without a single scare, while others seem marked early, every sidewalk and alley an exercise in vigilance. I've met people who are convinced nothing bad could ever touch them, unlucky simply doesn't apply to them. Others, sometimes after only a single close shave, begin to see each empty parking lot and bathroom stall as a calculated risk. Empathy grows between survivors of near misses, everyone else still lives in the before, unbothered, unconcerned, until lightning brushes too close to home. When you reflect on what keeps us safe, you realize it isn't just luck or strength, but patterns, rituals, a way of stacking the odds so that a moment of inattention doesn't cost more than it should. I remember stopping for gas with friends on a different road trip years later. One friend, Rory, big voice, loud laugh, never worried, wandered off alone to the ATM at 2 in the morning. Instantly, I found myself following, not out of mistrust, but habit. I caught up just in time to see him being crowded by two older men who'd appeared from nowhere, all too eager to help work the machine. My presence, just another silent witness, was enough to make the men fade away into the darkness. Rory shrugged it off. See? You're always overthinking. But months later, after another late-night scare in a different part of town, he messaged a thank you. Guess your paranoia isn't the worst thing after all. It's tempting, as we grow older, to wish for simpler times, for the childish confidence that told us we were untouchable. But the world isn't built to honor innocence forever. If you're lucky, you make it through a close call with nothing more than a sharper mind and a stronger sense of when to trust your gut. If you're wise, you pass those lessons along, quietly, humbly, as gifts rather than burdens. So much of self-preservation is inherited. You borrow a story, a warning, a routine. You realize, too, that courage isn't proven by ignoring danger, but by respecting the signals your own body sends. Every cautionary tale, whether delivered over coffee or in the hushed voice of someone texting from a bathroom at 2 a.m., is a piece of lived wisdom, a thread in the larger safety net we're all constantly patching together. What remains, after all the stories are told, isn't just fear, it's community. The willingness to watch out for others, to believe when someone says something feels off. I look at the world now with a different kind of clarity, never forgetting those nights alone, but also never succumbing entirely to dread. To be wary isn't to be afraid, but to be ready to move from darkness to safety, one thoughtful, precautionary step at a time. There's a quiet courage in the everyday adjustments we make after danger brushes past. No one talks about it openly, that subtle shift in posture when someone lingers too long behind you, the polite exit you invent from a conversation that feels charged. But it's there, tucked behind every little action, grown from every moment fear pressed so close you could feel its breath. Some of these lessons I learned the hard way, others were gifts, inherited in fragments from the voices of people I trusted. My father's warnings, precise and old-fashioned. Taylor's practical, sometimes irreverent advice on keeping your phone charged, keys pointed through your fingers. The echo of Marcello's story, reminder that even in familiar streets, unfamiliar dangers can flare up, sudden as a scream in the night. These fragments coalesced over time into something remarkably durable, a respect for gut instinct, and a devotion to never dismiss that first flicker of unease. Not every close call leaves a scar, but each one leaves a mark. I think back on that rest area in North Carolina sometimes, remembering details that only grew sharper with time, how cold the sink felt under my hands, how the man's shoes made no sound, the awkward choreography of walking calmly when all you want to do is run. The moment I saw those security cameras near the bathroom door, the flicker of cautious relief, they stand out almost as much as the fear. It's funny how the search for ordinary safety becomes a kind of ritual after a while, a pattern you never stop rehearsing. Caution can feel lonely, especially when you're the only one insisting on double-checking plans or accompanying a friend through an empty parking lot. But with every story I carry, my own, Marcello's, Gemma's, even Rory's, I realize I'm never truly alone in these instincts. The world is full of quiet sentinels, people who learn to listen, people whose vigilance is now an act of care for those around them. Sometimes, after a long stretch of uneventful nights, I catch myself lowering my guard, letting convenience outweigh caution. I'll linger in a store just to avoid the rain, or slip my headphones over both ears without thinking. In those moments, the old lessons return, wordless, but urgent. I'll think about the countless times hesitation or discomfort saved me or someone I know from a much darker story. I remember Marcello's breathless sprint, the city bus ride when a silent crowd refused to see, and my own razor blade shining beneath harsh fluorescent lights. These echoes remind me, we never regret the precautions we take, only the ones we let lapse. Even after so many years, strangers will sometimes share their own stories, on social media, in late-night DMs, after too many drinks at a loud bar. The details change, but the current is the same. Something felt wrong, and I listened. That's why I'm here telling this. We bond, quietly but deeply, over near misses, heartbeats, and second chances. The real power of these moments grows when we share them. They become warnings that aren't rooted in fear but in community, a kind of promise we make that, just maybe, someone else will remember our story and walk a little safer because of it. There's nothing weak about caution. If anything, every true survivor knows just how brave it is to say no, to trust a whispering doubt, to change the plan or call for help instead of risking bravado. Hard truths hide here, the world's surface is thin, and sometimes, just beyond, danger mimics routine until you learn to recognize its pattern. But there's hope, too, that for every unkind encounter, there's someone who chose to be wary, be stubborn, be present, and so the story never turns tragic. I wish someone had told me, years before my first brush with danger, that courage lives in boring decisions, leaving early, keeping company, setting boundaries that might look rude but feel safe. I wish someone whispered that strength is not just about standing up to trouble, but about sidestepping it entirely. Nobody grows up wanting to be the hero of a cautionary tale. But sometimes, when you're lucky, you get to be the hero who listened, who chose to come home, to stay whole, to let a strange night become just a memory, and nothing more. That is, in the end, the story I want to live and share, not just a story of fear, but of trust, in myself, in my instincts, and in the quiet web of warnings and wisdom we give each other. It's worth repeating, until the lesson is memory, and the memory is shield enough for every night alone. There's a peculiar kind of wisdom that comes only through living, a wisdom best described by what we carry, long after the world has given us reason to be afraid. If you ask anyone who's ever found themselves weighing the shadows as they walk, or scanning reflections for the hint of danger, or listening for footsteps on the edge of sleep, you'll find they all speak the same language, even if they never use the same words. It's a language of subtle gauges, a stiffness in the spine, a quicker heartbeat, a narrowing of vision to what matters most. All those little signals are lessons written invisibly in the body, until caution is almost a sense as real as touch or taste. Looking back on the stories I've lived, even those I only glimpsed from the outside, I can see how every incident left something with me. The lesson is never about giving in to fear, never about living with your back against the wall. Instead, it's about recognizing that fear, when harnessed and understood, is one of the greatest tools we possess. It's a kind of evolutionary whisper, honed over ages, imploring us to trust ourselves. The cost of ignoring it can sometimes be more than just a lost wallet or shaken nerves. It can be a moment you replay for years, always wondering what could have been avoided with just a little more hesitation, just one more look over your shoulder. The world doesn't come with guardrails. No matter how carefully we plan, there are always corners waiting to be turned, sometimes into wonder, sometimes into danger. To move through that world with courage isn't the absence of anxiety, it's the willingness to act on it judiciously, to assess, to prepare, sometimes to retreat. In my youth, I heard 1,000 times that nothing good happens after midnight. After enough years, I realized the truism is less about curfews and more about alertness. It's about noticing the changes in the air, the ways normalcy can twist without warning. As I grew older, I watched my perspective evolve. Teenage bravado, so certain that nothing could harm me, gave way to a carefulness I once saw only in others. It didn't make me weaker or sadder. If anything, it opened the world up by making me think more deeply about the people around me, strangers, friends, and relatives. I saw that all of us, eventually, face a moment when our security flickers, when our safety is ours to claim through a series of choices, both practical and instinctive. Little by little, I wove a toolkit for safety that never felt like a burden. Instead, it felt like power, walking with purpose, making eye contact in the right moments, shaping my environment wherever possible to tip odds in my favor. I've made rules and broken a few, but as time wore on, I paid closer attention to how my decisions shaped more than just my own fate. There's a saying among those who've seen enough to know how quickly fortunes turn: be prepared so you don't have to be scared. It isn't bravado. It's a kind of armor made of simple decisions. Years after those near misses, I still catch myself marveling at how easily a night can change from ordinary, to nerve-wracking, to just another story in the collection of warnings we pass around like family heirlooms. There's humility in this, and responsibility too. As I've watched friends, family, and strangers navigate their own close calls, I sometimes see echoes of myself: the hesitation, the careful calculation, the slow realization that something is off. I realize the sharing of these stories isn't just for catharsis or connection, it's a kind of encrypted guidance. Every time we repeat what happened, edit the details, laugh or grow serious, we're rehearsing a kind of lesson for the next time, or for the next person. Stories, especially those that brush against danger before retreating to safety, are essentially road maps. The stories themselves become a stand-in for experience, a way for others to walk with our same caution even if they've never seen shadows move quite that way, or heard footsteps behind them quite so close. So let me share, one more time, not the fear, but the fabric of preparedness that's woven from this series of events, from the parking lot in North Carolina to the alleys of Southern Europe, from the city blocks of New York to every suburb or rest stop where nerves start to hum. It means never ignoring a small voice inside, no matter how much it irritates your desire for freedom or independence. It means taking the extra minute to check the surrounding, to text your route, to hold a key or a blade or just a phone, and to believe that there is no shame in vigilance. It means refusing to let convenience erase the lines between comfort and risk, even when comfort calls loudly, tempting you to just relax, just this once. True, you can't control everything. Stories like Marcelo's and mine are reminders that randomness is always out there. But you can control whether you leave your fate up to chance, or intervene, gently and persistently, on your own behalf. Preparation may look like overthinking to some. But to those who have seen one night twist into a near disaster, there's no such thing as too much readiness. I watch my siblings now, younger and just as eager for independence as I once was. I listen as they joke about my rules: don't walk alone, keep your phone charged, don't be afraid to look someone in the eye and say, no, but sometimes they slip up and admit, you know, I thought of you last week, and I turned around instead of taking the shortcut. Just in case. And in those moments, I know these stories matter. Maybe they aren't loud or dramatic. Maybe they don't end with arrests or chases. But maybe, that's the best ending of all, the story where scary moments become only memories, where wisdom gets passed down and risk gets nudged away by readiness. There's power in the collective memory of those almost moments, whether it's in the caution learned from a sleepless night in a truck cab, a subway car full of blank faces, or a city street gone suddenly wild. If you ever found yourself feeling alone in that space between suspicion and action, know that you're not unique. Millions before you have faced that same quick calculation: is this harmless, or do I have to defend myself? Some trusted the wrong instinct and paid a price. More often, though, people find their way back from the edge because someone else lit a candle of awareness before them. That's why I keep sharing, and keep listening. Each time a friend tells me something weird happened, I hold back the urge to dismiss or minimize. Instead, I listen, validate, and add it as another page to a growing survival manual, one that belongs to all of us who move through this imperfect world, wanting not to be afraid, but wanting even more not to be caught unprepared. The last thing I want anyone to feel, after hearing my stories or Marcelo's or Gemma's or any of the countless accounts whispered in cities and rest stops and campuses everywhere, is the heavy anchor of worry. Instead, know that every act of caution you take, even if it feels awkward, even if others roll their eyes, tips the odds in the right direction. When you trust yourself, you teach others to do the same, and together, we become a little bit safer with each retold warning, each choice to listen to nerves rather than dismiss them. So the next time the hour is late and you hesitate outside a bathroom door, or pace another block rather than turning down the dark, or call someone just so your voice will echo in the empty hallways of night, remember, you're carrying not only your own hope for safety, but the hopes of everyone who came before, everyone who cared enough to retell their own stories. We are, all of us, the sum total of the lessons learned in those almost endings. And in the very act of sharing, we make it just that much less likely that darkness wins. That is how caution, far from being a prison, becomes a passageway, through the shadows, yes, but toward another morning, and toward a world where we make courage and care just as contagious as fear.